Perfect. Thank you. I'll try to be brief so that we have time for questions. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much thank you, Carl, for having me. It's a great pleasure. It was a pleasure to hear you and a great pleasure to be here talking about the special issue that we had on ethical perspectives on Carl's book. I wouldn't be equipped to present Carl's book, although it was a pleasure reading it over and over again and to co-edit this special issue with Roberto Merril, which is my advisor. What I planned for today, again, trying to be brief, is to present you the overall, what seemed to be the overall goal of the issue, also its contributors, try to tell you the key ideas on my perspective that the issue highlights, and then discuss briefly some of the points of the 6 particular contributions that we have, so that we can have a deeper understanding of what the authors were arguing for when discussing and presenting their ideas on Carl's book, and then have 2 general takeaways that can potentially, also the other ideas, they can also do that, but the takeaways can potentially segue into some of your questions or open up the discussion for us to follow after my presentation. So as Carl mentioned, this special issue, which came out on, I'm horrible with dates, especially because of the pandemic, but I think it was in 2020, late 2020, 2021, was basically meant to provide comments, insights, perhaps criticisms, although there's not a lot of that, on Carl's book that he has beautifully presented, at least what I heard about the last two chapters. And fundamentally, the contributors, I think, try to look at not only the question that Carl poses, what sort of experiments should we have and why, and what are the hurdles, the challenges, the benefits that we have from experimenting with UBI or unconditional cash in general, but also discuss in more detail, I think, some of the key questions that the book brings into the discussion, either aspects like the bottom line question or bottom line questions, which is a very pertinent point of Carl's book, the 4 recommendations when experimenting with unconditional cash. Some of the contributors look at that and try to expand a little bit on those recommendations or apply them. And also fundamentally go a little bit over Carl's book and provide some insights on what are the justifications for, not only what are the justifications for having experiments, but also which ones can be legitimate and why. This issue is also part of a project on UBI experiments that we have at University of Minho, which is in Braga, Portugal, that is now wrapping up. It's going to wrap up now at the end of July, I think, which is a project on UBI experiments. So we had a symposium on Carl's book, and it was great then to have the issue and have more people engaging with the book and discussing it. The 6 contributors, I think probably you had access to, I think you had access to the issue, were the 2 editors, me and Roberto. We had Wayne Simpson, Loke Groot, Mark Sanders, Stephanie Rosencross, and Timo Verlaat, and I'm probably not pronouncing their names correctly, and I'm very sorry for that. We also had Sara M. Constantino, and we had Bru Lane. And each one of these people, one is a co-author paper, but each one of these people contributed with their own ideas and papers, and we also had the possibility of having an intro and a reply to these contributors by Carl Witherbus, which greatly tied in the entire issue. So what key ideas I think are presented in the issue? So I think one of the first is the idea that we should be learning from existing and past experiments with unconditional cash. And again, this follows a lot from some of the insights that Carl has in the book and that you already know. So, for example, Wayne Simpson talks a lot about the negative income tax experiments that took place in North America and discusses the sort of impacts and the sort of learnings that we should be translating and we should be bringing into discussion today. And I'm going to highlight them in a bit. And Groot and all, for example, discussed the What Works, which was one of the unconditional or conditional cash grants experiments that took place in the Netherlands, and discuss also what sort of learnings they can bring when one tries to do an experiment on unconditional basic income. So in a way, some of our contributors really wanted to look at particular cases from experiments and highlight what key learnings are there to bring into the new experiments taking place or that are scheduled to take place, and how those are tied in with some ideas that Carl had in his book. Secondly, I think they discuss the current, instead of discussing necessarily only the current landscape of experiments, they kind of question whether we can discuss the entire wave of experimentation as UBI experiments. We are used to do it. Sometimes we do it for simplistic purposes and we say these are UBI experiments. Maybe we have an angle and we argue why we think that all experiments taking place are UBI experiments, or maybe we simply don't have a deeper knowledge, or maybe journalists are just aggregating for some reason and don't have a deeper knowledge on why one experiment can be considered a UBI pilot, for example, another is maybe a guaranteed income experiment. And our contributors, the one who engaged with this question, had different answers to it. So for example, Groot and all argue that we kind of can include all the experimentation taking place in the umbrella of UBI experiments, and they actually argue for targeted experiments for particular strategic reasons, and scientific ones also. Wayne Simpson, for example, believes we can do it, but we can kind of do it, but we need to be aware of the focus that we have in current experiments. So he argues that it can be problematic if we include all experimentation under the umbrella of UBI experiments and don't realize how some are so widespread in their in what they are trying to look at, or the types of populations that they are targeting, if they are targeted experiments, which then can become problematic for regional or for the global movement on UBI. And Constantino, for example, argues that we shouldn't, and takes issue with the fact that we are convoluting all the experiments with the name of UBI, and argues that that can even be problematic in the political and in how ideologically framed can experiments be. A third idea presented in the issue is the idea of what sort of experimentation should we have. And Carl he mentions in the book, and he was presenting to you the sort of recommendation on the book on maybe we can have experimental trials, but then we can use evidence either in microsimulation studies, either in qual studies, and try to have mixed methods to triangulate and to have deeper insights into the effects of unconditional cash experiments or even UBI pilots. And some of our contributors engage with this and discuss either as a given that randomized control trials, which is the so-called gold standard for experimentation, are the norm or are the best way to go with experimentation or saturation studies. Some discuss Carl's proposal and talk about simulation, microsimulation, and why we should be moving towards that. And then we also had contributors, like I was saying with Groot and all, who argue that regardless of the method, the point is discussing whether we go for universal pilots in the sense of, for example, having saturation studies, or if we should go for very targeted experiments and discuss who should be receiving the money and why. So these are also, it's a third point that I think the issue highlights, again, based on the contributions that we had. A fourth one, which is one of my favorites personally, that's probably why I brought it up here, is a discussion of the book's idea of bottom line question. I think this is one of the most pertinent topics, but it can also be one of the most difficult to settle, and we can disagree in the Q&A afterwards. So some of our contributors, for example, Groot and all again, they don't argue, but it is hinted on their contribution that labor supply, and namely labor supply of certain groups, is the key bottom line question that we need to answer. I, for example, would disagree, but it's interesting that they argue on that. We then have those who are arguing that overall labor supply is key. Wayne Simpson, for example, does that, but he says that we cannot only discuss labor supply response. We need to go into more details of it, namely time use and a little bit on consumption. It's as if we have a main question on labor supply, but instead of closing the discussion on whether the results are negative or positive and why, in the sense of having a positive response in terms of labor supply or a negative one, we should look into what are people doing with the time in case they are working less, or how is time changing in the case they are working more, for example. We also have a perspective from Merrill that, and you'll see what his contribution is about, that the key bottom line question is the funding claim. So the idea of how much can a UBI cost and can we fund it or not in particular contexts. And I think this is close to whether it is Carl's proposal in his book, although Mariel also talks about how, for example, in the Portuguese context, maybe the ecological broad question is also relevant in terms of a bottom line. And then finally, we have a perspective on the bottom line by Brulain, which argues that in fact, for most of our questions, we have positive results in the sense, and we were to expect positive results for most of our questions. And then we have others that maybe we cannot answer fully, or that it would be very difficult to have a definitive answer in a way. And as such, maybe the bottom line question is important, but it's not evidence that it's going to solve it. Then the fourth point, before going into each of the contributions, I think, is the different perspectives that come out from the issue on whether experimentation is important for political implementation. And we had a question before about political implementation. And here I want to say that since our contributors have very different ideas on whether the experiments can be framed under UBI umbrella or not, this means that in the contributions also, some are talking about political implementation of a UBI, whereas others are maybe talking about political implementation of a guaranteed income, which seems to be a lot of what's being discussed in the US currently. So some of our contributors argue that yes, so experimentation is important for political implementation. Like, for example, Wayne Simpson argues, although he says that experimentation does need to be very focused, or maybe because they feel that this is important, we just need to take into account some of Carl's proposals in the book, namely the 4 recommendations. This is Roberto Merriul's perspective. Then we have those who say experimentation is extremely important for political implementation, but it needs to be focused on particular groups. So it's not necessarily worth it to have a universal trial of a UBI. Rather, we should be focusing on targeted experiments that help us answer particular questions we have, namely on labor supply. And this is Grudenol's perspective. Then we have a third, which is say, maybe experimentation is important for political implementation, but we need to take into account and take for granted that political manipulation is going to take place. And I think this is in line with Carl's book arguments in a way. And this is what Laine and myself, Neves, argue in their contributions in a way. And then finally, we have Constantino, who argues probably UBI experiments are not, or GI experiments or unconditional cash experiments are not important for political implementation because of the risk of misuse and the risk of populism. Although then she provides an argument about local scale pilots and movements on UBI. And from this, it means that also a lot of the contributions engaged with aspects that Carl talked about, either the scientific or the strategic reasons behind having experimentation, and also the connection of both these reasons with the ethical controversies around UBI experiments. And so basically, it means that some believe political implementation might come from experimenting with UBI or unconditional cash, while others are kind of rejecting it altogether or are advising us about the risks of assuming experimentation can lead to political implementation, which again feeds into the whole discussion about how the political economy of UBI is very difficult. So now going over into each contribution before providing the takeaways on my perspective. So I'm not going to present it in the order of the issue, simply because I wanted to present it more in connection with the key ideas that I presented before. So the article by Wayne Simpson called Evidence, Experimentation, and the Ethical Debate over UBI, it has a longer title, but I simplified it for here, basically starts by discussing the role of the empirical and the connection between the empirical and the ethical claims. And I thought this was very interesting in the way he did it on the special issue, not only because of his knowledge of the negative income tax pilots, but also because of his very upfront argument that the negative income trials were framed around the perspective of work ethic. So since the beginning, the labor supply was important and was an important aspect to be assessed on the negative income tax. Also because there was a huge discussion about the productivity of the poor, how it can be raised or not. So that was, since the beginning, part of the framing of the pilot. And we sometimes forget about that when we then assess the results of the claims. And he argues that this is true, and this shows us that UBI might meet a certain evidence of reducing labor supply, for example, but the point is, how important is that, which is very in line with what Carl argues in the book. And so he then takes on the task of discussing how this connection between the role of empirical and ethical claims is important to convince governments and electorates to implement a UBI. So he's again stating that its UBI experiments are important and the end goal should be the political implementation. And to do that, he provides some of what he thinks are the key learnings from negative income tax experiments. So again, he says that they were framed by the work ethic from the beginning. So it's not surprising that a lot of the discussion afterwards was based on the work ethic. He argues that one of the things we should learn is the importance of having microsimulation studies after experimental evidence, namely to account for behavioral responses. And again, this is very in line with the claims Carl has in his book. I think that I would say that not only microsimulation studies, but qual studies are very important, and mixed methods should be definitely endorsed when we are talking about the sort of experimentation we should be having. But then he finishes off by saying that one of the key learnings should be that even if the need experiments can be seen as being partly detrimental to the UBI movement, although he doesn't agree totally with that, the point is that they had a lot of focus, even if it was on the work ethic. And he argues that focus in the current experimentation efforts is lacking, and we should be pushing for more focused experiment in particular issues. And we could say it would be the bottom line question that Carl is arguing for. And he finishes off by saying that another thing is trying to define the sort of problems which are very inherently linked with the bottom line questions of a certain experiment, which in the case of the need experiment for him was understanding time use and understanding consumption. And if that had been included in the study, we could have had a much richer perspective of the labor supply effects and the overall effects of the negative income tax. Another contribution who looks at learnings from past experiments is the contribution from Groot et al. I told you the names of all the authors before, which is called Experimented with Basic Income Inspired Experiments. And the first thing that they argue in their short contribution is that the experiment that took place in the Netherlands, it was one of the several experiments that took place, and it was called What Works, was not a UBI experiment, and for several reasons. It was not individual, it was not unconditional, and it was not universal. Only one particular strand of the treatment group received unconditional money, and a lot of their arguments are riding on that particular one. And they move on from discussing how it was not a UBI experiment to tell us why they think it provided important insights and learnings to those who want to engage with UBI experiments. And what they say is that whereas you can have Carl's proposal in the book of having experimental and then microsimulation studies to wrap up in evidence in a better way and have a broader scope analysis of evidence, namely of labor supply, what they argue is that we should be having targeted experiments. And they argue this based on their idea that our bottom line question should be labor supply response. So what they say is, if labor supply is the really difficult and ethical controversy and the real issue that we want to know from UBI, which they believe it is, at least in the Netherlands, then we should have targeted experiments to particular groups. And they say they are part-time working women, workers with earned income, families with young children, and self-employed. And they argue why these are the groups. For example, part-time working women, it's because there's a lot of writing on whether they will exit the labor market or not. So they argue why these are the groups that we need to have an experiment target to them, granting them a UBI to understand their response in the labor market. So they conclude, after arguing this, they conclude that by arguing this for this sort of experiment and having them in more places and more settings, we can have a sound strategy for a UBI political implementation, because we would be answered the main question of whether these groups would exit the labor market full force or not. So these two, as I told you, kind of rely a lot on past experiments to provide learnings. Then we have the contributions who focus more on the question of why having experiments at all and what sort of experiments. So Brulain discusses, and it's titled Basic Income Experiments, Limits, Constraints, and Opportunities. his critical point is discuss how a lot of the results that we have on well-being, health improvement, educational attainment were to be expected. We shouldn't be surprised that they were positive in the sense that they provided results of improved well-being and stress reduction. And he argues that we can hypothesize how in upcoming experiments, it's going to be the same. We're going to have positive results in some of these variables. And he argues this is to be expected because of three reasons. So because there's no bad press efforts, in a way, a lot of experiments might be funded or implemented with endorsement from local authorities or centralized authorities. And politicians usually don't want bad press, so they will frame it or they will push the experiments in a way that they will have some sort of positive results in these variables. The second is because they are redundant. We already have a lot of evidence on how giving money to people provides, especially to people who are very, very deprived, provides reductions in stress, improvements in health. It's to be expected that deprived people, if they receive money, they're going to have better outcomes in the number of variables that I was arguing. And thirdly, he calls the entry bias, the idea that how experiments are taking place, very difficultly, we will have neutral effects. Of course, we can have effects which are deemed negative or positive, but neutral effects would be very difficult to have. And so he asks, if we had such positive results and they are to be expected, why hasn't the UBI been implemented? And he argues that this shows us that it seems unlikely that data will be the definitive drive for political implementation, given past records and what's happening now. And following that, he goes into Carl's book's learnings and a lot of what the book is arguing for, to say that we need to look and to think about experiments as research and strategic or having political goals and understand the two, and focus not necessarily on whether we should be having it because of political implementation and having a lot of the discussion about we are not able to implement the UBI, evidence does not allow it to do that, and instead focus on what are experiments bringing to the table and how can we use it in the best way in order to implement a UBI, which is in essence what Carl tries to do in the book, which is to say, let's not focus about the question of having or not UBI experiments, let's focus on what we should do about the evidence that we have and the experiments that are taking place now. Then another contribution that focuses on trying to discuss what roles for UBI experiments and whether they are legitimate or what can they tell us is my contribution in the essay, which basically discusses if it's worth to continue experimenting, because it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, a lot of press that could be used maybe for the ethical debates on UBI. And I do think that Carl's book provides a good point for discussing what sort of experiments we should have, and it's important to have it. But I continue to think we need to discuss the legitimacy of experiments, not only because of their political, strategic, and evidence goals, but also because of the ethical components of an experimentation, especially randomized controlled trials, which are ethically, I think, sometimes challenging. And also because, as Carl pointed out, experiments are detrimental and have grown and continue to bring inputs into the UBI national and global movement. So I do think we need to discuss the question of should we have experiments or not. And I bring the concepts that Carl very rightly points out about having either scientific or strategic goals. And in the contribution, I argue that scientific goals and political strategic goals are very convoluted amongst themselves. They are not purely scientific nor purely political experimentation. And we can reject both at least a little bit in terms of legitimizing basic income experiments, not only because purely scientific experiments are subject to misuse and manipulation. It's still going to happen. So trying to have them as purely as possible is not going to work, as I think Carl pointed out also. And also because the evidence policy narrative has failed us. Evidence hasn't led to political implementation. And so what I argue is that we should look to legitimize basic income experiments on the grounds, strategic grounds, but in the sense of political advocacy. They can be important for strengthening local and national movements on UBI, who can then work towards pressuring governments to implement the UBI. And fourthly, I think they can be important to inform the ethical controversies around UBI. If we are talking about the reciprocity objection, the idea that people need to work or contribute productively in order to be granted the fruits of social cooperation, namely a UBI, if a UBI is funded through social cooperation. I do think that looking at labor supply and having evidence on changes on labor supply and what people make up of their time when receiving a UBI can be important for this discussion. Then, as I told you, we have two contributions that finally look at they agree that UBI experiments have been used for political implementation in a way, and they try to argue on how it can be important, how can we use them for political implementation, or on the difficulties of political implementation when using evidence from experiments. The first by Sara Constantinou, Cash Transfers UBI in a Changing Political Landscape, it's kind of, I think it's the most skeptical article that we have in the contribution. She discusses a lot about the framing of unconditional cash experiments. And she says that a lot of the experimentation taking place is not a UBI experiment, which I think Carl would agree also, but have been framed either politically, either in the media, either sometimes in the movement because of strategic reasons as UBI. And she believes this can be dangerous, or that we should be cautious when doing so, because using the UBI label and namely using the slogans of giving money to people can make the experimentation data and UBI in itself very easy and prey to populism. And she finishes the article arguing for 3 learnings from recent experimentation efforts, and which I think are important, although they're quite US centric, but since a lot is happening in the US, it's interesting to look at it. So the first is her belief that there's a shift in the deservingness discourse, especially in the US. So contrary to the work ethic, how work ethic framed the negative income tax experiments, it seems that now, in a way, the current experiments taking place under the umbrella of the Mayors for Guaranteed Income, but there are other experiments going on, are not so concerned with work, or at least are concerned with work and labor supply alongside other data and other variables. Secondly, there are different ideological framing when it comes to discourses around experimentation. And so she's arguing how sometimes the UBI is discussed as a mechanism to better promote work activation, whereas others it might be discussed as a mechanism for degrowth perspectives, or maybe is used as a mechanism to substitute existing welfare policies or to make welfare more automatic, more efficient, less bureaucratic. So she believes this should advise us on when we are discussing evidence in particular contexts and using it for political implementation, because we can enter into difficult terrain, and all of a sudden UBI is, if we don't agree, but it might be endorsed by populistic movements or by reactionary movements, and we might not agree with that. And thirdly, she argues that there's a new role for social actors. So whereas a lot of the debate has been riding on national or global movements or regional movements, she's arguing that now, especially in the US, the movements are highly localized, either in particular counties or particular cities. And she believes this can be an extremely well mechanism to counter maybe the populistic trends and use local movements and bottom-up movements to pressure local or national federal governments towards the implementation of a UBI. And then she finally sides with Witherka's book, arguing that a UBI does not need to be tested and maybe cannot be fully tested. This is her perspective, but it needs to be contested in ethical claims. And she believes local actors and bottom-up movements are probably better suited to do that. And then finally, we have Roberto Merril's contribution to the edition, where it's basically using the 4 recommendations and the main ideas that Carl presents in his book to try to understand how they can be used and applied in Portugal to convince the government to implement the UBI experiment. And he looks at the 4 of them in the Portuguese context. So on the back and forth from public discussion recommendation, he talks about making sure that there's an alignment with the ideological framing and the spirit of the Portuguese constitution that has an egalitarian ethos. So that's important to argue that a UBI cannot be a Trojan horse of the welfare state in Portugal. We need to frame it as something that complements the social assistance mechanisms in the country. Secondly, he talks about how to work around the effects. And he talks that in Portugal, the cost, like I told you, the cost and funding objection is extremely important, but because a lot of the political parties in Portugal that are endorsing a UBI are green parties, probably the ecological question has also to be debated or included. Then when he talks about the pragmatic versus ethical principles, he believes that the ethical controversies are part of the bottom line. He's a political philosopher. He believes that's the case. But in Portugal, however, again, he discusses that the economic cost is the key thing that we need to be at least arguing for on the first instance, and then we can go into the ethical controversies. And then finally, he questions how to use evidence to deal not only with the ethical controversies, but also with the ethical nature of experimentation per se. So he discusses how we need to engage with ethical controversies also of experimentation and not only of ethical controversies of UBI. So these are, I hope it was clear, but if you read the issue, probably it was clear. We can discuss more about it in the Q&A. I just want to wrap up with some takeaways that I was also writing after listening to Carl. So I think that the issue not only tries to complement and apply some of Carl's discussions on the book, namely the bottom line, the recommendations on type of experiments, what sort of experiments and why, but also discuss a little bit on the risk of spin and misuse and what's happening currently in terms of the UBI movement, but mostly the UBI experiments or the unconditional cash experiments take place. But I also think they go over a little bit and try to discuss the question that Carl did not want to focus on. And I believe it would be a different book. So it was great that we had this one about the justification for having experiments. And here, I think the final chapter of Carl's book, like he was mentioned, highlights that misuse and spin is unavoidable. And I think Carl said this in his presentation before, and we cannot run for it, which I totally agree. And I think at the same time, experiments are definitely, and you put it perfectly, Carl, I think it outgrowth of the UBI movement, both in terms of having resulted from the movement and providing inputs from the movement. And so in that sense, I think it's important that when we discuss the goals behind experimentation, we do keep in mind that the scientific and the strategic goals, either in terms of political implementation, advocacy, they are often very intertwined. And you can see if you go over a little bit on the data and the framing of each UBI experiment that has taken place. And so not only Carl's book is very relevant because it talks to all the actors who are both going to be more inclined to talk about the scientific reasons and goals behind experimentation, but also the strategic ones, namely the practitioners, the politicians, the researchers, the citizens who are interested in UBI. So we need to take this into account. We need to understand how to navigate an ecosystem where different stakeholders are going to have different motivations around what an experiment should tell us and why an experiment is taking place. And I do think that Carl's book beautifully helps us with this. And I think the issues make an homage to how Carl's book does exactly that. And finally, I think they all agree, many or most agree with the complexity of determining the bottom line question. And this is one of my outstanding questions of determining what is the bottom line that we need to know on UBI. Do we have one for the global or regional movements, or do we have one for the national movements, or should we have one for local movements? Which highlights again the puzzle of the political economy of a UBI in different contexts. And it makes it so difficult to understand how experiments can help us in the political implementation. So I just want to close by agree with one of your final points, Carl, which I again feel the contributors probably would agree also, which is that experiments won't help us solve nor settle the debate on UBI altogether. And so it's worth noting, and it's worth being aware that we cannot expect too much of UBI experiments or unconditional cash experiments. And so we need to temper a lot of our expectations and understand how different methods and different strategic and scientific tools can help us make sense of the impacts of UBI. So I think this is it. I hope I didn't go over too much. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm open to your questions.
Okay. Now, we have students ready to respond, and they worked out amongst themselves how they're going to do it. Because the 2 chapters I presented went so long, we're a bit late. But I have Catarina and I have already agreed that if we go over now, she can come back at the beginning of class next week and we can continue the discussion then. Can you all stay here at least until 5:45? Okay, so we've got at least a half hour today. We'll see how that does it. Okay, who's first in the response to Catarina?
We had like a couple of like 4 or 5 articles to discuss this issue, and we divided among for people. So I chose the article by Joseph Diamond, whose title is "What If Anything Can Justify Basic Income Experiments: Balancing Costs and Benefits in Terms of Justice." And the main thesis that this author makes in this paper is that in order to justify an experiment, she thinks that we should pay attention to 2 variables: the costs and the benefits of these experiments in terms of justice. And then she proposes a mathematical approach, a very simple mathematical approach through an inequality, where in one hand of the inequality you have the benefits, and in the other hand of the inequality you have the costs. And the idea is that by trying to, let's say, measure these costs and these benefits in terms of the impact on justice the experiments would have, you could justify carrying out this proposed experiment or not. So basically, there are like two main kinds of benefits. One are direct benefits of the experiment itself, and the other would be the hypothetical benefits the experiment would have on a broader scope, and also based or factored by the political will to implement a public policy based on that previous experiment. And on the other hand, you have the cost of the experiment itself, and also what she calls a sort of opportunity cost of carrying out this experiment. So this is like the basic approach in this paper. Then she goes further on each of the issues, but on high level perspective, this is what she's developing in this test. I understand that also we should try to propose a critical approach to this paper, so I thought and also try to involve everyone in the class to discuss this topic or this idea. So I think although the basic idea of the author is very interesting, because she's talking about an ethical issue that sometimes is very hard to approach from a quantitative point of view, that is justice. She, on the other hand, is also contributing by a mathematical way of trying to balance these different variables. However, I think that there are also other aspects that we should bear in mind when talking about basic income field, basic income experiments, which are not only related to justice, and not only for let's say an ethical issue, but also from let's say from a perspective of what is the political reality. The professor said that one of the main issues that was discussed in the 70s was how much work or labor, or how much less work or labor people who are beneficiaries of basic income grants would put. So, and that was one of the main issues that was discussed in that moment. So I think that that's a good example, a real life example of how an experiment can be spin in one direction or the other. So when talking about if you can justify an experiment in the field of basic income, I think we should also bear in mind other things that are not strictly related to cost. I think that although of course what the author is proposing is very interesting, and she's like also proposing a methodological approach that is worth taking into account, we should also pay attention to other political things that might at the end become an obstacle for carrying out this policy in a broader scope.
Okay, do you want to respond?
I can respond, sure. I think you need to mute yourself. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Esteban. Yeah, I think you are right. So it's sort of an analytical philosophy proposal to try to balance it out and find a very simple equation to be able to assess whether experiments are justifiable or not, or whether it's also in a way, tries to draw from utilitarian conceptions and try to understand whether we can assess the potential benefits in terms of justice versus the costs, not only the actual cost of the experiment, but also the ethical cost of experimenting, which is tied in with justice and tied in with ethical controversies around experimentation, especially when we have randomized controlled trials, but not only in that instance. And I think in a way, it's interesting because for me, it was interesting because it brings the discussion about whether not only if we should have UBI experiments because of the UBI movement, but also whether we should have UBI experiments in the first place in the sense of being a social experiment, as Carl was talking about. Is it ethically, especially when we are talking about target and conditional experiments, meaning that they are targeted and the treatment group are very deprived populations as a control group, is it ethical to have it? Are we going to gain a lot in terms of justice in the medium long run? Namely, are we going to be able to implement it in order to justify having an experiment now? And I can tell you about my own experience now. So my PhD, I'm doing my PhD in political philosophy, but I'm in Philadelphia in the Center for Guaranteed Income Research. And I think you all met Amy and Stacia, or at least only Amy, which is the head of the Center for Guaranteed Income Research Center here. And I've been here to study one particular experiment, which is taking place in Paterson, New Jersey. And for those of you who don't know, New Jersey is a very unequal state in the US, and there's a lot of very wealthy and affluent places, and a lot of very crime-ridden and very poor, although interesting cities like Paterson, which is a melting pot. And one of the first things that an experiment is taking place there, an unconditional experiment. And one of the first things that I was can tell you upset, not only because I was in the US for a very few time, I wasn't in the US for a long time, was the ethical dilemma around having people receiving money, whereas others know that some people are receiving money, but they are not, and are all part of an experiment taking place with an end goal of maybe force the New Jersey County, maybe force the state or the federal US government to have a guaranteed income. So it was more than just simply discussed during the time I was interviewing people, more than simply having in mind how an UBI is important for just reasons, how it would be important to have the evidence to push governments, federal, state governments, local governments to implement a UBI. I was concerned about how in the moment I might be sacrificing my own ethical principles and might be very detrimental to the populations where we are because of being granting money for 1, 2, 3 years without any assurance that the evidence is going to suffice for the government to implement the guaranteed income. And of course, we can go over a little bit more about how the evidence is important, how the movement is important, how maybe simply receiving 3 years of a guaranteed income is already amazing for some of these people. But I think, although I agree with you, Esteban, that there's a lot of important political, strategic aspects which are not included in the simple equation of the article, which tries to understand how we can make sense of experiments, at least it provides us a very good framework to be aware of all the ethical controversy around experimenting with UBI that's related with many more things than simply discussing whether experiments would lead to political implementation or whether experiments show us that people work more or work less. Thank you.
I'll be discussing the second paper, which is why do we run basic income experiments from empirical evidence to collective debate. And this article starts with the question of what, if anything, can justify a basic income experiment. And the justification for this is two-pronged. The first is that it gathers empirical evidence. So this is the empirical claim. And the second is that it can prove that basic income is an ethically desirable measure. So this is the ethical claim. And the empirical claim is a much more straightforward claim because we can see that UBI experiments, even the ones from the 1970s, gathered a large amount of empirical data. And this data kind of proved a positive effect of UBI. But the ethical claim is a little more complex because there's two questions. The first would be that is a basic income experiment needed to validate a moral claim? And the second is if basic income is an ethically adequate manner to cope with the issue. So in the case of poverty alleviation. You wouldn't need an experiment to validate that poverty should be alleviated, but you would need an experiment to determine if basic income is the ethically adequate manner to alleviate poverty. So then the paper uses the Barcelona basic or the B-Mincome pilot as kind of its reference in explaining this framework, which was a 24-month experiment that used RCT methodology. And so in terms of the empirical claim, the results showed a positive impact in terms of quality of life, happiness, and well-being. But then in the paper, they kind of grazed over the labor effects because they said that the evidence from the pilot could be deceptive, especially how the labor effects, the evidence from that can be kind of misconstrued in like wealthier countries. And then in terms of the ethical claim, they focused on the ethical issues associated with the hypothetical effects of basic income, which then basic income would presumably advance. And they looked at the ethical questions of the benefit itself, like should it be conditional or unconditional? And then they also looked at the ethical questions on experiment design. So I think one of the things they talked about is how they don't want the experiment to exacerbate like gender norms in a household. So then for my kind of question on this article, I was wondering if maybe the B-Mincome experiment was not the appropriate experiment to use to apply this empirical claim and the ethical claim framework, because it was not fully an unconditional experiment. And it even said that it was designed to patch or more strengthen the traditional policies rather than completely replace what was already there. So I guess I was wondering if another pilot or experiment, maybe one of the ones that are in more of a developing country where there are more people participating and it more closely follows a universal basic income, if that would have been a better reference experiment to apply this framework.
Yeah, I think you have a very good point. My take on the article is that they wanted to show us that although you do have the ethical and empirical claim, for the most part, one strand of the empirical claim is predictable. So I was saying it's predictable in the sense that the results are redundant. We are to expect positive results on a number of things: well-being improvements, stress reduction, health improvements, educational attainment. We have found that across sites, even in between developing and developed countries. The difference is maybe in size, right? In very deprived developing countries, which I don't like this word, but in global South, it's more common to have huge results in terms of well-being and maybe health improvements, whereas in other contexts in Western, for example, in Europe context where you have strong welfare states, maybe you're going to see less about educational attainment and health improvements and maybe more about stress reduction. Whereas maybe in the US, you're going to hear a lot about health improvements given all the problem with health insurance and all that. So I do think that what they are trying to say, partly at least, this is my reading, is that part of the empirical strand is solved and predictable. So maybe what we should be focusing on is how some of the issues on the empirical side, needing to know more about labor supply, the feminist concern about whether women are going to exit the labor market, can be intertwined with the ethical controversies. Because for the most part, some of the things that UBI, I'm very sorry, my street is kind of busy, so you're probably hearing an ambulance or a firefighter, sorry. So some of the things that we want to hear about a UBI are, like Carl rightly pointed out, are ethical controversies that cannot be solved entirely with data, namely with data about labor supply, namely with data about women's time used, and so on and so forth. So what do I think they are saying is, although it cannot be solved, can certainly be reinforced. So if we know more about how people, the behavioral response in terms of labor on a UBI, maybe we can have a more informative or a richer debate on the reciprocity objection. If we know more about how women are going to behave in quotes when they receive a UBI, especially part-time or unpaid caregivers, which usually are women, if we know more about that, we're going to be able to discuss in a richer and more empirically sound, and especially that resonates more with what's happening on the field about the discussion, the feminist objection, very broadly, feminist objection to UBI. So I think that's one point that they're trying to make. Now, in terms of your question, I think your question is great, and I think you are extremely right. So one of the things that I was arguing about the article that Sara Constantinou has on an issue about UBI experiments is saying that we are now using UBI experiments as a label to talk about all unconditional cash grants that are experiments that are taking place. Whereas we have very few, and Malcolm Torrey in this other issue then talks about that, we have very few actual UBI pilots, especially in Western countries. So what's happening in the US are, for the most part, targeted low-income experiments, the guaranteed income experiments. What happened in the experiment in Barcelona was an experiment whose goal was not necessarily to test a UBI. The goal was to understand whether unconditional cash versus conditional cash, where the conditionality is attending voluntary group, which is not voluntary, but attending community-based groups, or whether conditionality with entrepreneurial courses, or whether strict, rigid conditionality and all these sorts of different compositions impact on well-being, stress reduction, and social inclusion. And actually, one of the things which I think they talk about in the paper that happened in Minkum is that the treatment group that received unconditional cash fared worse in terms of social inclusion than the conditional groups. But again, this is to be somewhat, although they didn't dive into it in the qual data, but it's to be expected. So a lot of the people that were part of the experiment were low income. They are maybe from vulnerable populations, maybe from migrant populations who are very detached in a way from the social context where they are. So when you provide them money and you tell them, you don't need to make regular proofs about your poverty situation or your employment situation, but you are welcome to attend this session where people in your situation are sharing their stories, so please come. Of course, these people are probably going to feel more embraced. Of course, they're going to feel more included. They're going to start having maybe a safety net, at least an emotional safety net in the context where they are. So I think it would be to be expected that these groups fared better in social inclusion than groups that were granted an UBI and nothing else. So this is a very long answer to say that, Anna, I think you are right. Maybe they're very careful in saying this, but maybe some of their arguments are partly skewed by the example that they chose and are not necessarily universal. We cannot make them universal in terms of the discussion between the ethical and the empirical claim. Having said that, I think there's some truth to the fact that a lot of the impacts on guaranteed income and UBI are redundant, namely well-being, stress reduction. We already know the impact money has, especially on lower income groups. And so it's not surprising that we are to expect positive results on those variables.
Yeah, we're really getting the sounds of America.
I'm sorry for being very US centric, but I've loved the US context, and it's so boiling with guaranteed income that it's kind of inescapable.
I was thinking more about the sirens and stuff.
Okay. Also that you're hearing the sounds of Philadelphia. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Who's next? Niharika, you're next.
Yeah, so I did the article by you called Basic Income Experiments, Expanding the Debate on UBI and Reciprocity. So this article is about the norm that how, if we are entitled to receive benefits, we have the social obligation to kind of pay back for what we receive. But since basic income is unconditional, it violates this requirement. And there has been a lot of theoretical discussion on this, but not a lot of empirical evidence, except the one of labor market participation, because of instrumental difficulty in evaluating reciprocity in the context of UBI in experimental setting, because such settings are in what she calls as non-ideal settings, while in theory, the settings are quite ideal. So the goal of the article was to provide some questions on the moral principle of reciprocity and the perception of the moral principle that could be changed with the basic income. this is important for discussion because it is an argument against unconditionality of basic income. And there are various views on that. And I really like the views that you have provided. So the first one is that reciprocity should not be considered as the deciding factor that for the distribution of entitlements. And the second one is like the opposite of that UBI transgresses the principles of justice. And then there's like this alternative version, which is kind of like in between, I feel. It says that, so it talks about that UBI violates the reciprocity principle, but it is still preferable to others because like to others as in the conditional or means tested transfers, because we kind of don't have the necessary background conditions for justice, to say that in your words. And so this view presents the idea that like because the others are still worse, this is kind of still better than them. Then the article talks about obligations of the moral principle of reciprocity and basic income. For example, whether the institutionalized norms are violated if some decide to withdraw from the labor market, what could be defined to be a meaningful contribution, and perceptions of moral principle, whether there is like trust building up with other individuals or the state, what are the perceptions of people with respect to other marginalized groups, and what are their perceptions with how the UBI would be funded. Would it be from income tax or national resources? So I have a question regarding what you talked about, the ideal settings and non-ideal settings. So you said that there's like a wide gap between what evidence tells us about reciprocity, because experiments are more in a non-ideal setting, whereas if we talk about it in theory, it's in a more idealized setting. But if we were talking about it in reality, there would be other contingencies as well. And how far do you think experiments would still be, say, non-idealized? Because I think reality could be much more non-idealized because experiments are still kind of controlled, whereas the reality is not.
Thank you so much, Niharika, for your comments. So brief context. This was one of the first papers that I've written in the context of my PhD, which is on UBI and reciprocity, which is something that I love and I'm very passionate about, but it's difficult because a lot of things have been written about the objection and how to try to solve it, and partly because there is this tension between how political philosophy often deals with the objection, which is under what is the ideal setting, which is a setting where, especially when we talk about John Rawls, where everyone at least has the first principle of justice partly solved, the idea that we all have same equality of opportunities, we have material resources and goods, and so we have a kind of a free choice to be able to reciprocate, a free choice to be able to contribute productively in the community. Whereas what happens in what I say non-ideal context, but which is our lives, is that the capacity for reciprocity, the capacity to be a productive member of society, if we want to say it like this, is unevenly distributed. So it makes for a difficult discussion if the objection is being discussed at not a high level, but in an abstract level of ideal setting, in this sense that principles of justice are being met, everyone has the conditions to be able to pursue their good life, and so some might decide not to be productive members of society or contribute out of selfishness or something else, and we can judge that morally, whereas what happens in reality is very, very, very different. So that's one of the backdrops of my thesis and of this paper particularly. The second one is how usually, even in political philosophy, I think, but in general, when we talk about reciprocity, when it comes down to the distribution of entitlements, we are very focused, we are very skewed with work ethic on discussing labor market participation, which can be highly misogynist because we are not considering, for example, care professions that are being conducted by unpaid care workers for quite a long time, women most often, but it's also limiting the analysis of how families take care of each other, friends take care of each other, neighbors take care of each other, people doing volunteer. So the range of occupations that people have is so big and can be so, and it is part of contributing to society, that just limiting it to labor market participation, it's wrong, or at least it obscures a lot of contributions that people have in the places where they are living and in their own occupations. So what I try to say is that not only we have this tension, and the tension Nyarika was like trying to say is that experiments are happening in non-ideal settings because they are happening in contexts where, again, material resources are not evenly distributed, non-material and non-material resources. The capacity, if we want to use the term, of reciprocate is not evenly distributed. So if we judge experiments with the same token that we judge the ideal context where the reciprocity objection is being formulated, we're going to obviously have a mismatch. What does this mean? If we simply believe that what political philosophers are arguing about, people need to contribute, if they are granted a UBI and have equality of opportunities, all the material, non-material goals to fulfill in life, and then they are not contributing, they are free riding, they shouldn't be granted anymore a UBI because it's unfair. If we translate this objection towards settings where we grant a guaranteed income or a UBI, but people don't have, sometimes they are very small, but don't have all other material and non-material possibilities in their life. They have instances of intergenerational poverty. They haven't had opportunities throughout their life cycle and their families. If we do that, we're going to have results that feed into the perspective that a UBI is unfair because people don't reciprocate, but does not really encompass all the way people are indeed trying to being productive members of society, or most importantly, actually already being productive members of society, simply in other ways that are not participating in the labor market. So that's what I kind of try to argue. But since then, just as a single point, since then, and especially because of the work I've been doing with experiments, I think we can even discuss it a little bit differently. And even in non-ideal settings and ideal ones, we can discuss how a UBI, in fact, might not be reaching the objection of reciprocity because of the obligations that a UBI creates on those receiving it. And that's something I've been working on now, and it's an additional to this discussion. But yeah, I hope it answered your question, and thank you for having read the paper. Thank you all of you, actually, for having read all the papers.
I think we maybe should take it from here at the beginning of class next week.